You're watching or listening to Private Members Club, and for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be talking about this week in politics and a little bit of last week in politics as well, I guess, so you don't have to. I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
So we could talk about, well, what do you think of X and what do you think of Y? But I think what do you think of X and what do you think of Y is pretty obvious, really. Rishi Sunak being a twat. And I don't know, Russell Brand being a twat, and I don't know, Rupert Murdoch being a twat. It's basically all people just outing themselves as twats at the moment, isn't it?
In slightly different ways, but yeah.
I think we'll discuss, but I want to bring something up, an idea first, and I want to run it by you and see what you say,
Okay.
because this was something I hadn't really thought about. And actually, I was listening to this was on Newscast, and one of the guest commentators they had on Newscast just said this in passing, and kind of the conversation moved on. So it was just left sort of hanging in the air, really. And they didn't dig into it and they didn't discuss how or why. But this person said, oh, they could call a snap general election now. Rishi Sunak could call a snap general election. And as soon as this person said that, my immediate thought was, don't be silly. And then my very next thought was, and this was, well, and everybody knows we're Doctor Who fans, right? So when we first heard the rumour that Tennant could be back, your initial thought was, don't be silly. But the more you dug into it, the more you thought, no, actually, it makes a lot of sense. So I want to throw this idea in front of you and just see whether you think, like I do, that it's not as ridiculous as it sounds, which is not to say I expect it to happen, but just to say that ridiculousness when I first heard her say, oh, snap general election, very quickly turned to actually it makes sense. So here's the thing, Sunak is deeply unpopular, but Sunak's not going to get any more popular by just Sunaking for the next 12 months the way he's Sunaked for the last 12 months. What he really needs to do is to try and judge a crescendo of alternate opinions such that he can surprise people into voting for him at a general election. Because I don't think anybody in their right mind goes, oh yeah, Rishi Sunak, that's the viable option. Let's vote for Rishi Sunak and for another 5 years, just like the last 12 months we've had, because that would be utter insanity, right? But if Sunak can tweak people's opinions for a brief enough time in a sort of heavy enough way that he can get people just to consider him long enough that if he calls a snap general election while they're considering him, they actually go into the election thinking, oh my God, maybe I do have to vote for Rishi after all. And so here's kind of what I see would be the way this would pan out if this pans out. He's just rolled back on a lot of green policies, right? And the way he's rolled back on those policies is by looking at them. And if you divorce the policies from the context of the policies, then the policies don't actually look like they necessarily need to be there, because most of the policies are there because of the context within which those policies exist, such as, for example, the move to electric cars is not necessarily about having electric cars in 2030, because most people still won't be driving electric cars in 2030. But the context of that policy is there are people doing university courses or college courses or whatever to learn how to be mechanics and operators for the machinery for electric cars. There are factories gearing up to making batteries for electric cars, and so on and so forth. If you rip that out, the electric car thing, by actually taking away the electric cars for another 5 years, it doesn't actually look like you've done an awful lot. And if you don't think about it, if the general public don't think about it, then they just think, oh, that's okay, we just keep our ordinary car for 5 years longer. Of course, that's not how it works. You can keep your ordinary car anyway. But what does happen is if he rips the electric cars out, all these other industries suddenly get 5 years worth of progress, development, evolution taken away from them. And instead, they go 5 years backwards, which puts them 10 years behind, because instead of having 5 years of forward progress, you've got 5 years of devolving instead. But Rishi's point is, if he does that, if he sets that in front of people and says, look, stick with me, you won't have to replace your car in 5 years, which they wouldn't have had to do anyway, what he can then say is, oh, and now look, Labour and some Tory MPs and just government and the establishment and the man in general are trying to stop me from letting you keep your cars. You better vote for me, so I've got a manifesto to let you keep your cars. That's stage one. Stage two is he then calls upon people to say, right, we've been trying to get rid of all these foreigners and we can't do it. They won't let us do it. Labour won't let us do it. The establishment won't let us do it. The man won't let us do it. And the European Convention on Human Rights won't let us do it. Let's get out of the ECHR and rewrite our own Convention on Human Rights such that we can put in little loopholes so we can get rid of all these nasty foreigners that you don't want. And then he'll say, oh, but I want to get out of the ECHR, but Labour won't let me do it. The government won't let me do it. The establishment won't let me do it. The man won't let me do it. Vote for me, so you've got a manifesto so that I can force this through. So that, do you see what I mean? He's going to turn it into woke for broke. Everybody else is trying to mess you up except me. Vote for me. Give me the manifesto. And do you know what? That is precisely the tactic that Boris Johnson used in the last general election, when the Tories should have been decimated and instead got an 80-seat majority. Now, I don't think if Rishi Sunak did do that, he would get the 80-seat majority. But what I'm saying to you is, I can imagine that it must be running through his mind that this is just about the only prospect he has of winning a general election, regardless of how unlikely it is. So I don't think the prospect of a snap election in something like 3 or 4 weeks' time is actually that far out of the question. I don't know. What do you make of all that?
Well, I don't think snap elections tend to take place 3 or 4 weeks' time. So I think a snap election would be next spring. That would be
possibly,
a snap election, and that probably wouldn't happen because of Christmas. But I think an early election is a possibility. Yeah, I think it's about. I think you're probably giving them too much credit for political manoeuvring. I think they're just at the moment, Labour is aligned with them on a lot of policies. But I think it seems that way because Labour have started declaring their position in areas that normally they'd keep quiet about, because they're basically defanging things like Brexit, immigration, to the environment to a lesser extent. Keir Starmer is basically like going full-throatedly initially for those policies, so the Tories don't really have a leg to stand on attacking Labour, and then Labour can be more progressive in other areas. And I think the Tories are kind of just panicking. Sunak's panicking because there's no wedge issue. There's nothing they can run on. It's becoming increasingly less realistic to point at Labour and say, well, you're bad because the Tories have flip-flopped so many times and have gone down, and they continue to go down different directions in different bits of the party. So I think the environmental thing.
But this is kind of what I mean. It feels like Sunak panicking and going for his version of the thing that Boris Johnson used successfully back in 2019.
I mean, they saw the Uxbridge by-election. They won the Uxbridge by-election slightly, just about, and they see that they won that primarily because of an environmental policy that was unpopular in Uxbridge, and they would target that as a kind of wedge issue. And then they've tried to extrapolate that onto a national level, which would be the net zero stuff, even though that's not the same thing. But they've tried to make a lot of the net zero policies really frightening by they've made up kind of prospective laws not just based on vague recommendations, but actually based on misinterpretations of vague recommendations. Things like 7 bins and gas boilers being banned and various things. He's just made up a load of shit and just said, well, that's not going to happen, like it wasn't going to happen anyway. So he's kind of given them an excuse, and they've used the economic difficulties that they put us in as an excuse.
Well, yeah,
to create a wedge with the environment. And I agree with the EHRC. The EHRC, I think, would probably be the next thing, because Labour's kind of not hardline about immigration, but Labour aren't particularly progressive about immigration numbers. They've got a different direction in how to control immigration, but they're not sort of uncontrolled immigration. So the only way the Tories can kind of attack Labour, because those nuances aren't like vote winning, like Labour wanting to talk to France. Maybe there's a bit of Brexitiness there, but really it's just a different approach to the same exercise. So the only way the Tories can attack Labour is by creating this myth of lefty lawyers, of whom Keir Starmer is a lefty lawyer, basically stopping the government doing what they want to do. And I think the EHRC would be a kind of a good figurehead for that.
Yeah, because it's all about creating straw men, dozens and dozens of straw men, and just pointing the finger of blame at everybody else and calling everybody else the establishment when you're the one. And going back to the subject of Russell Brand, this is exactly what Russell Brand does these days, isn't it? He goes on about everybody else as if somehow the establishment and the sort of, the industry's got it in for him. He is the industry. He's been in the industry. He's made millions out of the industry. And that's who does he to think he is a common man?
And that's the problem the Tories have, is normally it's easier to go into an election as the opposition attacking what the institutions, the government's been doing, offering alternative solutions. And Sunak's actually trying to do that, but he's attacking the institution, which was him, and governments, the Tory governments before him. He's attacking policies that Boris Johnson's created, that Theresa May's created. It's just a kind of an understandable act of desperation, because they're not doing very well. They collapsed under Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, and they've run out of basically wriggle room to try and say, well, we're a new thing. They can't say that they're new anymore, because they've gone through so many permutations. They've actually run out of Toriness to be, different aspects of Tory to be. And you can see that within the party. Boris Johnson's attacking Sunak. Nadine Dorries is attacking everybody. Liz Truss is attacking Sunak's economic policy. Well, Johnson's attacking Sunak for his environmental U-turn. Liz Truss is attacking him for his economic stagnancy.
It's like a hydra where all the heads are trying to eat each other, isn't it? Basically.
Yeah. And to be honest, I think Labour have been quite quiet in certain areas. They're not making promises. So one thing that the Tories are trying to do is making these pledges and making promises that aren't panning out, but they think they can make promises because I think they know that they probably won't have to deliver them. Well, Labour isn't making promises, and I can sort of see why, because they're desperate to be slightly more honest than that, of not making promises until they know, because they don't know what the country's going to be like when they take power. So you're not going to make any promises. But they can start to creep into these promises a little bit and start suggesting how they would manage things.
I wish Labour would be a little bit more forward about not making promises but making pledges. This is what we'd like to do, because possibly, they have a little bit of a sort of
bad history, where Ed Miliband famously putting his pledges on a big lump or a big tombstone.
But what I mean is, even just in interviews, they run very timid of actually saying this is how we'd like things to be, and these are the reasons why that might not be the case. Because I mean, it's all about what kind of economy they inherit. It's about, because here's the thing about these green policies is, people want now for Labour to say we'll reinstate them all if we inherit the country, but potentially that could still be 16 months away. Labour could be in a hung parliament And 16 months from now, like I say, you'll not only have lost 16 months of progress, but you'll be going backwards for 16 months instead. So actually, it would be nearer 3 years that you're behind, and you'll be less than 5 years out from 2030. So it becomes almost impossible to catch up. So by the time, if Labour do get in power, they can't. It's impossible to reinstate those targets.
But it's slightly more complicated than that, I think, because the big car companies in this country, I think what their problem is not just the delay. I think it's the uncertainty. I think so. This government delays it by 5 years, and actually Labour coming in and bringing it back to 2030, that's just creating more instability. At some point, the car companies want, somebody to pick a date and stick to it. So 2035 is bad for the environment. It's not a good thing. But if it had always been 2035, I don't think the industries would have had that sort of problem. They just need some sort of stability so that they can project into the future. And I think that's the challenge Labour have. I think Labour is going to be more progressive as it gets close to an election.
Well, I hope so. And in fact, I hope they're kind of disguising themselves so they can be more progressive after an election than they are in the promises before. It's also about manifesto, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think their job at the moment isn't saying things like, free broadband for everybody or let's nationalise buses. Their job at the moment is basically a game of chess where they're kind of taking the sting out of the wedge issues in the future that the Tories could use. So they're slowly kind of taking pieces off the board that the Tories could do. It's a game of chess at the moment, so that when they do get to, the conference to start with, but then on a proper election footing, then they can start putting forward their proper manifesto when people will remember it. And when they get to that stage, the Conservatives won't be able to attack them in certain areas because they've already made it clear what their policies are before. They've already put that out of the way. They've got rid of the controversy behind it.
But at the moment, there's a certain amount as well where they're just putting out the fires or showing how they're going to put out the fires that Sunak and Truss and the others have been lighting, really, and leaving them with.
And by doing that, pointing at the fires.
And saying that's the idea.
It's kind of all they need to do. You just, look at how rubbish the country is. Look at how things are falling over.
The trouble is, then Sunak points back and says, but the fire's your fault. I mean, this happens. This is how it works these days. And, a certain amount, hopefully not a great amount, of the country believes him because that's how it works at the moment. I want to come back to that in a second. I just want to make one further point. I hope that there's a certain amount at the moment to which car companies are having quiet talks behind closed doors with Labour politicians and just having a quiet, what are you going to do? Well, this will probably be it. So, OK, we'll keep up the progress on what we're doing in the expectation that you'll be there in a year, 18 months time, and we can pick up where we left off.
And Labour is having quiet and not so quiet talks with. We know that they're having talks with industry leaders. We know that they're having talks with the French president.
Yeah,
because there has to be an expectation. They have to start these industries, other world leaders have to start thinking. Well, the likelihood is there's going to be a Labour government, so let's start getting to know Keir Starmer and finding out what they're doing because they need that sort of stability.
Rishi Sunak at the moment is just like a little kid throwing his feces at the wall,
and he's not very good.
No,
he's not actually. He's slightly saner than Liz Truss. He's more competent than Boris Johnson,
but only by degrees, really. I think.
He's not very good at communicating, though. I don't think he struggles with interviews, and he struggles to keep focus on what he's saying in interviews. He's very
from a broader perspective, I think he doesn't. I mean, he has an ideology, but I don't think he has any clue how to put an ideology into practice. So it's either faltering steps, no steps, or giant leaps. But there's no sense of actual progress towards the ideology that he clearly believes in.
But I don't think that's necessarily a fault of of his or his intelligence, I think, he's in a screwed position. His predecessor pretty much crashed the economy.
Fair.
Her predecessor pretty much screwed any kind of confidence in politics, and his predecessor actually, thinking back on it, was the last great prime minister we've ever had.
Theresa May,
the golden age of Theresa May.
Yeah.
If you think back of it.
She was the prime minister who did nothing and lost an election, basically.
And she
stayed in power but lost an election.
And she was screwed because of Cameron. Basically, each prime minister has screwed the next one. Cameron put forward the referendum. Theresa May had to pick up the pieces of the referendum within a divided party. Boris Johnson was a genuine idiot. And Liz Truss.
You say Liz Truss wasn't?
Liz Truss was insane. So Sunak, I think, is a more conventional prime minister. He is a more conventional politician. He would have a chance in a good headwind of running the country competently, I think, broadly speaking. But he doesn't have a good headwind. I'm not saying I would vote for him.
Yeah, I don't even get the impression from him that he's that competent. I think he has an air of competence because of who he's followed, but I don't get the impression he's that competent at all. But there's one thing I want to bring up before we move on, something that came up in our WhatsApp thread with the others before we started, and that was that I think it was Ian posted a poll saying that Sunak, and it's on the BBC as well actually, is at his lowest approval rating since he took power in the wake of this policy shift. But I said to Ian, maths, especially election maths, doesn't necessarily work like that. And I think the sort of Trump situation in America is kind of another example of that. And here's the thing. At the last general election in America, Trump's numbers had actually gone up, but the Democrats' numbers went up by a great deal more. And so Biden won by many millions or whatever it was, despite the fact that Trump's numbers had gone up. Now, you keep hearing in America, Trump has a base that will come out and vote for him, but he's not going to appeal to anybody outside of that base. So he's not going to be able to push the numbers up any further than that base. I think the problem in America is, and this is assuming that Trump does get the nomination and somehow manages to make his way through all these trials such that he's still electable at the end of it. Do you know what? I think people would still vote for Trump even if he was in prison. So I think all bets are off on that one. But my point being, I think Trump's numbers don't go up, but I think Biden's numbers potentially could crash and Trump could win because the Democrat vote has just not come out for Biden.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to relate that back to Sunak, and I'm saying I think that's Sunak's only hope is that if he appeals to enough of that red wall that Johnson got in 2019 with these anti-woke sort of culture war measures that he's trying to bring in, if he appeals to enough of that wall, he might manage. I'm not saying I expect him to, and I don't think he will. I don't think there's the remotest chance that he will. But this has got to be the thinking, and this is the only possibility for him to win. If he appeals to enough of that red wall, he might manage just to take enough seats that he manages still to cling on to power, even with a sort of much reduced majority, or even the biggest of the minorities, if you see what I mean. So I think Trump and Sunak could win. Probably won't. Obviously, hopefully won't. I don't believe either of them will, but I certainly think it's not beyond the realms of possibility, because I think the thing about election maths is it's not like normal maths. It's not like I've got more friends than you, therefore I'm going to be in power. It's about I've got more friends than you, but your friends are more interested in what you're doing. So your friends are going to come out and be more positive and get behind you, and that's going to shove you over the line. If Sunak gets the country angry enough, that could get him back into power, in other words.
So, it's more complicated than that because...
Well, sure, but we're on a half-hour podcast.
Even if Trump gets more votes than Biden, he still doesn't get necessarily elected. He needs, to shift a few thousand votes in 3 states to get elected. And that can happen because it's unreliable. but I would imagine Trump's votes go up somewhere like Florida and Texas, phenomenally popular. But that doesn't matter because Florida and Texas have already gone to the Republicans anyway. So it's kind of all about Michigan.
But I wasn't talking about Trump's vote going up. I was talking about Biden's vote crashing.
And again, it depends on which states that's likely to happen. Yeah. And Biden's a big Rust Belt kind of icon still. I think he's white and he's from Scranton or wherever. So I think there's a degree to which Biden is sort of safe. I don't think it's guaranteed, and I think that's always the risk that you never know. But these things have to hurt Trump in certain areas, and they won't hurt him in certain areas. But a lot of those areas, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in Iowa whether Trump's popular or not or what happens. And here it's even more complicated. I think from what I understand as the Red Wall, they're massive Boris supporters still. So they were voting for Boris Johnson in the Red Wall, and Sunak isn't Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson is attacking and has a voice in these areas. So I think, and also he'd need to win a lot of the Red Wall.
But this is my point.
So it's
Yeah, but this is my point. They're Boris Johnson supporters because of what Boris Johnson stood for. And if Rishi Sunak comes out and says they're going to take your cars away, they're going to take your roast beef away, if we don't do something about the ECHR, they're going to be taking your jobs away. He's appealing to those same baser instincts that Boris Johnson was. That's what I'm saying. But if he gets the country angry enough, and the country comes out and votes for him because they think he's the savior.
Yeah,
unbelievable, but that's the policy.
So I think in this case, I think his personal opinion polls are worth looking at, and if they're low, then that's very unlikely because that would be a national poll. And also there are a shit ton of by-elections coming up, and I think they're a good indication of national swing, regardless of where they are. If Tories start getting voted out in places they really shouldn't be voted out, and Uxbridge, the Tories won, but not by much. I mean, they kind of, as I understand it, they kind of scraped in, and that's the sign of a swing.
Well, that's it.
And then
that's why.
And then there's the Scottish question as well. The SNP don't have Nicola Sturgeon anymore, and they're sort of mired in scandal, which I think, they're not
Labour's hands,
yeah. They're not a shoo-in in Scotland. I think they have been for a few years, but I think if Keir Starmer can win back Scotland, he wins back the country. So I think it's unlikely, but it could happen.
Well, I think the thing. I think
if the economy starts improving, if I was an old-fashioned, if I was like working for the Clinton campaign team, you think if the economy starts improving, then the government would start having more chance. But I think that period of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, COVID, Partygate, Tickler, or whatever his name was, Pincher, I think that's caused. I think the Tories are hoping that that's going to be a distant memory by the time the next election comes, but I don't think it's a distant memory yet. I think people are remembering, and I think that's going to scar them.
But this is my whole point, is that he tries to whip up a crescendo of hate that climaxes at the point of the general election.
Yeah.
And such that
I'm sure he will be. Yeah.
Such that everybody's focus is on all the things that he wants their focus to be on.
Yeah. But you can do that with something like Brexit, even though it's incredibly complicated in a sense.
That's
you sell it as an incredibly simpler thing, in or out. The Labour government wants us to stay in the EU. The Tories now want Brexit to mean Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. That's a sellable thing. They don't have that anymore. Well, so they have these little they're trying to test these little wedges to see how they work. And I don't think there's any wedges that are necessarily going to have that impact.
But yes, but the ECHR is potentially the next Brexit, isn't it? It's not as big as Brexit, but the ECHR is the thing that still ties us to all those things that people thought they were getting rid of when they voted Brexit.
I don't think that's going to go down. I don't think in Darlington people are going to care that much anymore.
Well, they might not care.
I think leaving Europe is a big thing. Leaving the EHRC, when you have to have people explaining what it is, I think, you know, that's not going to be, and you need something on the scale of Brexit in order to like win back a lot of the voters that he's potentially lost. I think there's, you know,
yeah,
it's cool, it's possible, but
I
think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely.
You've got to remember, never say never to JR, because I'm Nostradamus.
Yeah.
Let's change the subject slightly. Russell Brand, I've always thought he was a wanker, and it turns out he really is a wanker, but although it turns out he probably doesn't wank quite enough, quite frankly.
Nice.
What do you think?
Oh, so I've always, my impression of Russell Brand is he's always appealed, he seems to appeal to people who think he's really clever.
He's not, but though. I've never understood this.
I mean, that kind of baroque, I mean, that's me doing Russell Brand language, that kind of baroque fancy language.
Words,
it's just
me.
Yeah.
The words he throws in mean nothing in the context in which he's using them. And yet people still clamour around to tell him how clever he is for using these words. No, he's learned a word. He doesn't know what it means.
Yeah. So back in the day, I found him at best irritating. I didn't find his comedy particularly funny. I didn't really get it. I don't think I was young enough, possibly. Admittedly, I never really questioned his kind of promiscuity, because actually he was very good at masking it by being incredibly open about it. And the media were very open about him, the Shagger of the Year. So they kind of numbed us to it, and it's only on reflection, a bit like Jimmy Savile, I guess. It's only on reflection you think, actually, how, you know, of course this was going to happen, and he knew it was going to happen, which is why he's now making millions from YouTube channels peddling conspiracy theories.
And not even YouTube, it's the one in America. What's the one in America called? Bubble,
Humvee or Buzzles or
something
like that.
And that's where. So, and here's the thing about Russell Brand. He reminds me, and I'm taking a step back from the actual allegations and just talking about his personality for a bit, or his ideology. He reminds me a bit of that kind of sort of post-hipster sort of ideology that's so far on the extreme that it thinks it's on the extreme of social awareness and of socialism, I guess. But it turns out it's more libertarian than, you know, sort of. And it very quickly transpires that being that far into that extreme, but without, again, it's all about the context. It's all about what surrounds it. If you kind of have this ideal about this extreme, even if you think it's a sort of socially conscious extreme, if it actually comes back to it's not necessarily socially conscious. It's all about basically you, and it's all about the image that you're projecting and portraying of yourself. Then that comes back to, well, that is about self and selfishness. Rather, so there's a kind of a thing at the moment in politics where there's a kind of brand of people who are kind of, they portray themselves as the caring left, but they're swung so far out on the extreme that they only really care about their point of view. These really extreme extremists, and there's a kind of, it's like that, they talk about the horseshoe, don't they? But the horseshoe that kind of joins at the far end, and what's happening is there's a muddle at the far end where these people. So I'm sure, I guess what I'm saying is, I'm sure at some point Russell Brand thought he was on the side of goodness and right, but the thing is, he swung into that other area now where it's incredibly not about goodness and right. But because he came from this foundation of thinking he was about goodness and right, he's probably firmly in the belief that he's still about goodness and right, even though basically he's tipped over into neo-Nazism almost.
I mean, I think it's complicated, because I think libertarianism is sort of off the horseshoe a little bit. It's an ideology, but it's not necessarily a political ideology. It's a social ideology. which appeals to, right,
Both sides.
left, wherever.
Yeah.
And I think that's Russell Brand. But I think in this country, and I think this is where the sort of anti-Semitism in far left Labour comes from, because they really are on that horseshoe tipping over into, there are things that Jeremy Corbyn believed in that actually the right wing of the Conservatives believe in, and there are things that Jeremy Corbyn's brother is so far left that actually he hangs out with far right figures and they join together. So that, politically speaking, I think there is a sort of shared belief system between them. Russell Brand, I think he's pretty much apolitical. I think he sees himself as not being affiliated to any of these, but his attitudes do seem to appeal to the far left or the far right at the moment, because he's pushed himself to extremes. I think he's genuinely done it cynically. I don't think he actually believes a lot of these things. I think he does it because he's recognized that he gets money through being popular.
And to a degree, he's protecting himself, isn't he?
Yeah, and to be popular, you need a voice, and he knows that these things will come back to bite him. So he's tried to maintain a voice by kind of going onto Bumble or whatever it is and YouTube and developing a cult following. He's tried to turn himself into a cult, and the easiest way at the moment of doing that is by being anti-vax.
He's what David Icke would have been if Twitter had existed when David Icke came out as the son of God, right?
Yeah. So I think he's a worrying figure, because I don't know who because people listen to him and I don't know who that is, and it tends to be, I would imagine, well, I don't know if it's young people anymore. It will be people who are in their sort of 20s, 30s now, I guess, because they would have grown up with him.
But I think there is also, I think there's a sort of, not maybe a big niche, but certainly a niche of young people who find it easy to sort of follow these ideas. Because here's the thing, if you put an idea in front of somebody, but you don't give context for that idea or alternatives to that idea, then you can just make that idea seem really sensible, because they don't have the context and they don't understand that there's alternatives if you don't provide that stuff. And that's kind of the thing with the sort of social media age, isn't it? It's really easy to put ideas in front of people now without contextualizing them or giving people, access to alternatives. And if you don't do those things, that idea can become rooted enough that when they do understand the context and they do understand that there's alternatives, the idea's already taken root, and then you get confirmation bias instead, don't you?
Yeah. And it's also about sort of this kind of freedom of speech thing, which GB News also has this big thing about freedom of speech, even if it's contains factual errors or terrible views. And
the sort of freedom of speech legislation includes the caveat, but that doesn't include speech that's likely to incite hatred. It should now include another caveat, but that doesn't include speech that peddles untruths deliberately in order to change opinions.
But also our news media, our broadcast news media is regulated. They're supposed to be based in fact, and there's journalistic, I mean, at the heart, the unregulated heart, there's journalistic ethics. Journalists are trained to be in a particular way and to gather evidence, much like the journalists who broke the Russell Brand story. They gather evidence, they present it. There's a problem with GB News because half of GB News kind of does that, just like half of Fox News does it. But then it kind of blurs seamlessly in the evenings to people who don't do that, people who aren't journalists, people who are just talking their opinions, and you can't tell the difference. And then that blurs onto YouTube to someone like Russell Brand sitting down giving his truths, his true news to people who listen under the framework of freedom of speech. And so suddenly, and Tucker Carlson is also on YouTube doing the same thing, pretending to be a newsreader, pretending to be a journalist. They're all pretending to be a journalist. And that's dangerous because it's unregulated, because they're not journalists, they're not trained, they don't have any standards governing them.
They've all seen Network just once too many times.
Yeah,
probably.
Exactly.
Final word then on Rupert Thingamajig. Rupert Thingamajig?
Murdoch. Talking
the
about
name went. But I mean, there's not really a lot to say. But I just want to say a word about him because it's become clear. Because I don't think he's that interested in the politics so much as he's interested in whether he can influence the politics. And I think newspapers still have, I do believe they still have a massive influence because, not because of their reach, but because of the way their reach extends beyond their reach. So now in the social media age, one of the things that happens is if there's a big splashy headline or a big story that catches people's attention in a newspaper, that accelerates throughout social media like this big wave. And so, yeah, some things come up naturally through social media, but I think the newspapers still dictate a lot of what people talk about, even if people aren't aware that they're getting these kind of opinions and things from the newspapers themselves. So coming back to Rupert Murdoch, why I think that's relevant in the conversation about him is he's not interested in whether what he's doing is good or bad. He's not interested in whether what he's doing is politically to the left or politically to the right. All he seems to me to be interested in is whether he can influence the conversation, how much power that gives him, and how that power can distend itself out, how far that power can distend itself out among the populations of various different countries. And I think that makes him an evil person, frankly, because when you have that much power and you don't care what you do with that power, then you're using that power to ends that are not good, that are not beneficial for the people that you're extending that power over. I think that's evil, frankly. And to be honest, this succession just seems to be more of the same. And I think it's criminal. I just think it's evil. Frankly.
Well, he's not testing how far he can go. He's basically his mission accomplished because he's got Fox News, and Fox News has huge impact in the States. And yeah, newspapers here slightly lesser, but they're still still
big. Yeah,
they're still got a punch. I don't know. I mean, he's 92. He's not going to be alive much longer. But Lachlan Murdoch is, by the sounds of it, pretty much the same. So it's not going to change. So it's just he's not new in the universe. This kind of wanting to use newspapers to change the world or to do anything. I mean, Beaverbrook back in the day, and then beforehand, any sort of.
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, but that doesn't mean we can't call it out.
I think things that people like Elon Musk are possibly equally, if not slightly more worrying, because they genuinely do have power to change the world. I mean, Elon Musk, at a command, can turn off the internet in parts of Ukraine and, kill people or change the outcome of a battle. He can just do it because he thinks he knows how to bring something to an end, or he thinks he's got an idea that he wants to test on the situation.
He's like a child, isn't he?
Yeah, but it's terrifying, and I think Murdoch's actually not that terrifying.
No, I think he is. I think it's obvious,
but he's done the same thing for decades. So we know exactly what he's like and what Fox is. It's there now. You can't. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, but the point is, we do know what he's like. We do know what Fox is like. We do know what the Daily Mail and all these other things are like as well. Yeah. But that doesn't stop them from doing the thing that they do.
But sometimes it does. So Fox News did sack Tucker Carlson, and they did get fined, and the News of the World did shut down. But
the News of the World got replaced, and Fox News have reverted back to where they were before.
Well, yeah. And
they all snap back. It doesn't change anything. It's tiny ripples, but the big waves just keep on rolling out.
Yeah.
Well, on that happy note, shall we call it a night then?
Okay.
Until the next time we do this, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And we will speak again soon.